The format we had yesterday was to basically briefly discuss what we had today and what we heard today. So I think most of the task falls onto Matt's shoulder today. And then, but I have asked Ilya and Jim also to join us, that they can steer the pot, and there's a lot of controversial ideas that we can actually tackle here. So let me briefly introduce them. So Matt is a professor of neuroscience here at Peak Hour. So he studied neuroscience at Caltech and did pioneering work in revealing neuronal replay, and has done fantastic work in the hippocampus, and he's one of the most knowledgeable neuroscientists that I know. And I love always hearing Matt and reading his papers. Ila did her PhD in physics, and so she has been also doing really fantastic work in bringing theory and combining mathematical models with multi-neuron recording and understanding what is going on in the hippocampus. So this is really cool, and she has done beautiful work. And Jim has been the director of this center, and before here, I think he was at Johns Hopkins, and he has done also amazing work in terms of understanding how to create some sort of a virtual model of deep neural networks that represent the constraints that the visual system actually show us. And I think that was a very interesting set of work that he and a student of his, Dan Yamins, did some years ago. And since then, he has been moving forward. And I think one of the cool aspects that Jim brings to the perspective is that, he's showing that how you can actually use this sort of a control perspective and engineering perspective of prediction as a way of explanation of the variance in the models. So without further ado, we'll go forward and let Matt actually take the lead in just steering the pot. Do you have a speaker?
Yeah, great. Are we on? On? Yes. There we go. Yeah, thanks, Nima. That, your intro sounded like the kind of intro that ChatGPT would generate. Very. And I think I only throw that out there because I'm going to sort of frame this with big picture questions and then try to relate back to sort of the topics and things that came up, things that I sort of thought of, questions I thought of with the individual speakers. And so, the big picture question is, I think, Mackenzie gave us a sort of a great view of where, a platform that has sort of served the community, can serve the community, where it stands now, what we can do today given, what we have, a great model, sort of a current model of sort of open data sharing. And the bigger picture question, which is one that ChatGPT doesn't do well because, as it was pointed out, it doesn't do well at extrapolation. And that is, where are we going next? Where is the field going? And how can we anticipate the needs of that sort of future field and how open data and data sharing can actually contribute to it. One of the things that kind of came up in thinking about a lot of the tasks, and I sort of think of a point that Jim likes to make in sort of introducing the models, the benchmarking approach, and what neuroscience, even a lot of sort of kind of contemporary sort of machine learning, AI applied to visual processing are focused on, and that's the first 200 milliseconds. And it's a very narrow domain of processing, sort of brain-related processing. And there's a thought that the problems of tomorrow will involve extending that into a domain of increased complexity, where we're thinking about complexity that will involve sort of planning, memory, prediction. I have to point out precisely the things I was telling Mackenzie. We had a recent sort of the Center for Brain Science and Machines. We invited some outside, speakers, including, the sort of the luminaries in the area, sort of in DeepMind and in AI, and they pointed out that they felt like they were tackling. They had sort of superseded the need for neuroscience. They were tackling the hard problems. There were only a few things that they weren't actually able to capture, and that included, like memory prediction, planning, small things. So, and they didn't feel that they actually needed us to address the problems or challenges that they had. And so, in a way, what they're saying is, we're taking on the accessible problems. We will leave to you the hard problems, and the hard problems presumably why we're here, are problems that will require some kind of collective effort. They will require us to, move not just as individual entities, but as a field. And so thinking about, what do we have to do? What would we have to do? What would be the model of data sharing that might take on a task that was more complex? I think that question got thrown out there. What is complexity? You can think about extending it in the time domain. It might include, something like planning, where now behavioral variability is not just, sort of on the, the time scale of seconds, but might be on a longer time scale. Might involve tasks that require, decision making. So you kind of think about all this, and you think about the data that we have just given these sort of, very bespoke tasks. Now it becomes more complex. And so I think I'm sort of thinking about all of these challenges: more data, more complexity. What are the models? What are the kind of benchmarks that we would use if we wanted to test these models? Those are the big picture questions. If I threw that in the ChatGPT, I can only imagine the nonsense that it would actually spit out. So I think we can do better. And then just sort of thinking about going through the various sessions. We kind of started off, again, Mackenzie gave a great, overview, and I was thinking in, some of the later talks, and she pointed out the power of, sort of Zebra contrastive learning, which I also, I love. It's sort of great when you have, you're trying to separate labeled data, but thinking about how do you incorporate, if you want to do real, sort of predictive encoding, putting in predictive encoders, how do you incorporate time? Bob talked about adding in MoSeq, which, uses some of that sort of the time series predictive, processing. But I was thinking what it took to actually integrate that into the overall platform, and that made me think about, how do we want to approach, platforms that allow that kind of integration, thinking about pipelines that might demand additional complexity, and if it's that hard to incorporate like one, sort of particular algorithm with all the benchmarking that goes with it, is there, are there some general lessons or principles that we can take from that? I know, Mackenzie pointed out just the cost of maintaining the platform as it stands now, and I'm even just thinking about tomorrow, it's like an R01 just to do that. And so, what is the model? I don't want to get into the money thing. We have plenty of that. I think it's really more about the model. And one thing about that came up in in the next session, and that was it was sort of the idea of, they were like hackathons, and the notion of sort of a distributed model. And that is, should we actually use something instead of, sort of focusing on, these kind of shared consolidated platforms? Is there value in actually distributing this? Are there ways that these could be coordinated so that they actually can, you might think of, sort of standards, data standards that sort of foster communication. But again, are there certain things that would be better if we sort of distributed them? Obviously, there's value in cross-validation, and that sort of reminded me, Alessio, when he was talking about, the spike sorting, and invariably sort of puts up all the spike sorters. It's like, look, they're all different. And it's like, yeah, that's because, they're all right, consistent, and they're all wrong, because they all are based on, sort of a sort of a ground truth model, which is not something that you can do for every cell, every spike is not the same. I always like to point out in the hippocampus, there's actually more variability across spikes within a cell than there is in spike waveform across cells. And that's because they exhibit these complex, so-called complex spikes where the amplitude changes, the spike width changes. So you actually have changes in spike morphology that the changes are more consistent with identity rather than difference. And so what you really are doing, you're doing some kind of probabilistic inference. You need to have some sort of prior model. And so thinking about, that means that your spike sorting requires that you know the cells that you're sorting on. And so again, it's back to this sort of, you need to kind of customize things. Having, sort of one package, one system that serves all is not really going to work. And so thinking about how we, how do we achieve that increased demand for specialization while still allowing for sort of, broad access and the ability to do the kind of cross-validation, which is required to do. The other things that kind of came up were the obvious need for vast amounts of metadata. A lot of metadata, labeling very important. And one thing that didn't really come out, and that is the question of authentication, metadata authentication. How do we know? And it's not the validation, it's just like, how do we know where those labels came from? And you can think about, well, part of that is we need the data that was used to generate the labels. So if you're saying, oh, the animal was, I don't know, went into REM or something like that. Well, how did you do that? What was the algorithm? What was the data that you used to do that? And it could be anything, any of these sort of labels. And so it's thinking about that sort of next level of data required. Again, getting back to this notion with increased complexity, we're going to need data, not just the raw data, but the data required to authenticate, and then subsequently to validate. And the validation presumably will benefit from having the ability to do this cross-validation, multiple methods to give us the same label. Back to like the spike sorting, the spike sorting thing. And then this idea of sort of thinking of sort of complexity and where we go next. And Andreas's talk where he talked a little bit about he talked a lot about like sort of the inception loops and how you sort of develop and test these models, and a little bit on the microns. But the microns was one of these sort of big picture blue sky. If we kind of throw everything in there, what can we get out? And I think that I think it'd be useful to think about what are the approaches? Is more data or sort of these large efforts to do comprehensive cross-registration reconstructions for structure-function analyses. Is this the way to go? How do we do this in in this kind of open, sort of shared environment? And then I sort of mentioned Bob's work in the next session, which was sort of the neuroscience, the toolkits. I mentioned Alessio's the spiking, and then and Andrea the hackathon, the distributed model, and then sort of when Andrew's talking about the sort of the Human Brain Project, another large effort. Kind of thinking about, you might think, what is the redundancy with some other efforts? How does this compare? And what was actually put together? Is there redundancy? Is that a good or a bad thing? With efforts like sort of IBL also trying to put together large platforms with sort of common sort of tools and structures. Do we need more large initiatives? And is there a need or value in coordinating across them? I think in Martin's talk, the benchmarking, obviously, there's incredible power, and it's sort of, I was thinking of this question of how it scales with complexity, cognitive behavioral complexity. And in Shreya's talk, actually, so thinking about in the motor cortex, I was, and maybe I'll just throw this right out there. I immediately was thinking about Bensei, Levesky's work in M1, where he kind of shows you don't need motor cortex to execute, but to learn. And so again, this idea of learning as a part of the, again, this sort of the behavioral complexity that comes into it. They're laughing because I'm going on and on. But that's my job. I'm supposed to give the recap.
Is this Matt color commentary on the entire event?
That's what it is. I am giving the color commentary.
You've been bottling it up for like 2 days.
And then I'm going to shut up because the idea is to get response from the panel, their thoughts about that, and then open questions from the audience, and then any additional peanut gallery view, thoughts from the other panel. Jim?
We're the peanut
Exactly.
Sorry. So I can turn it over for additional thoughts from the panel, and then I think kind of throw it out to the real panelists, that is the speakers today, to sort of comment on any of those things. And if they don't have any comments, which is also perfectly fine, questions from the audience.
Jim, you were talking about
do we want to have a data-driven sort of like exploration, or do we want to have like a hypothesis-driven exploration outside we were chatting? And do you want to reflect on that in terms of this whole idea of like, okay, let's record more data, and what do we do? What do we learn from it? Like if we have access to like a million neurons versus 100,000 neurons, and if we don't have the hypothesis for the million neurons, are we going to gain something out of it? And how do we constrain this? How do we move forward in this sort of like a data-rich environment, but sort of theory-poor system?
Are you asking me to
Yes.
come? So first of all, I was roped into this like 15 minutes ago, so I'm not all prepped for this, but and I think I want to hear from the speakers mostly, but I think, so I would just, I was ready to, I can sort of motivate that if you want, but I think this is the time for the visitors to tell us. Answers to Matt gave a whole lot of, I couldn't keep track afterward. The first thing you said, I want to reiterate, like, what's the future in 10 years? And the discussion about that, I think, is the rallying point. Like, what do we imagine there? And that's part of it, I think, but let's hear from others.
Anybody?
Oh,
Yeah, Eli had something to say.
Oh,
With the microns, which I think, so the microns, unfortunately, I have just got like 3 slides at the end. So the microns, conceptually was this sort of alignment of data, like structure and function. And I think one of the huge potential impact that it has, and I think this also maybe defines a future 10-year plan for many other projects like that, is that if you think of like really big questions in neuroscience, one is the tremendous diversity of cell types that we have. If you look at the brain, we knew this since Cajal, you look at it and it's like, just in the cortex, it's like hundreds of different cell types, have very distinct morphologies. Now we know, there's huge programs from the NIH about, transcriptomic cell types that are being in human, in different animal species. It's really amazing, right? But if you actually look computationally what they're doing, we know very little. It's a huge gap in knowledge, right? And if you look at like ChatGPT or any of these neural networks, it's very hard to understand why there's all these cell types, right? Because you can have like one cell type or maybe 2, and you can train these networks to be extremely intelligent. So I think the microns data is very unique right now because under constraints, of course, it was like, the project started many years ago and it took years to finish, but it has an alignment of about 75,000 years ago, function and structure together. And this, there's another mouse, the one that is publicly available now, that one is still being processed. It has only the excitatory cells functional image, but there's another one that we have also the inhibitors. And I think this is a tremendous opportunity for people that have theories, ideas, whatever, to figure out why is there all this diversity. It's like, it seems like we're looking at the blood or the heart or the kidney and we find all these cells and we don't know what they do. The other thing is that if you look at, let's say, the field of psychiatry, and there's a lot of excitement there, is that a lot of the approaches to treat a lot of these diseases, people are narrowing it down, then they have to manipulate cell types. So I think this bridge is very important. And the other one, of course, that I think is harder is the connectivity. To figure out what's the relationship between computation and connectivity. The problem right now there is really computational. The data, it's been segmented, but the axons, it needs a lot of curation, like manual proofreading. Just to give you an estimate, is I think about 100 or 200,000 things that look like neurons or glial cells, and only like a few hundred have been proofread manually. This is a very difficult computational problem because human annotation, and this is taking a lot of work. I think this is sort of where things could be going, and I think figuring out how to do these projects in other species, like in monkey ideally, or where we have structure and function, I think this would be very fun.
yeah, when thinking about like that, one thing about like cellular diversity is that it's also like a diversity of time constants. That's one of the things that really separates a lot of these cells, and that is because it's regulating neural dynamics. And clearly dynamics are the things that are missing, except for like, Tria's talk, where you're explicitly incorporating dynamics, trying to predict dynamics. And so when you have complex dynamics in your tasks or in your data, then those things are going to be relevant. When you're only looking at that, like first 200 milliseconds, yeah, it's not clear what are all these cells doing? Well, they're not doing anything yet, because you're not looking at when they actually do.
So I guess I'm coming at all this amazing work that you're all doing from the perspective of probably an end user. So my lab does theory, we do computational modeling of neural circuits, and I guess one of the challenges that we face as theorists is, you know, on the one hand, there's this incredible richness of data and data sets that are out there, but we have a very hard time matching our questions to the right data sets. I think that's, you know, that's very difficult as theorists. So, you know, students, when I teach a class, beginning graduate students, you know, even postdocs, they've got some questions, they've got some problems, they've even got some models, and now they want to see whether those models are relevant, whether, you know, they can test the models, and there are data sets out there, I'm sure, but like finding them is really challenging, right? Like, is it a data set that has enough simultaneously recorded cells? Is it under this condition? And, you know, so that's a problem I feel like hasn't been solved. Maybe you're all working on it. Maybe things like large language models allow us to query the data sets, right? And like, you know, in addition to the tags that you add, it can, you know, query them and have a digest. The other aspect is, of course, experimentalists, you know, trying to, you know, we have sort of, on the one hand, a bunch of experimental data sets, and on the other hand, we've got like a list of tools, right? Like I'm just seeing the talks that happened today or the course of the day. There's like tools, like incredible innovative work on tool development, incredible data sets, and now we want to be able to build all possible pairwise connections between them, right? Like I want to run any of these data sets with any of these tools, and I guess again, we don't have I mean, I think the dream would be to like have something I just click like, you know, run isomap on this for me, or run like Procruste's alignment on it for me, or whatever it is that I want, and I should just, you know, do that. And I guess that I feel like, again, as a, you know, theorist, where each of us is building things like that in our own labs. And I know there are also some bigger efforts, like Alex talked about, you know, you're building all these ways to do shape alignment, but I just feel like as a field, we need that. And then the third thing, I'll just comment on, and then I'll stop because I'd love to hear everybody's perspective on this, is like, so one of the things that Martin talked about, and, you know, also has been going on in Jim's lab, is something like BrainScore, where what you do is you bring your models to them, and then they test your model on their data. But in machine learning, another common mode is that you know, you build your model, and then you bring in a data set, and then you test it, right? Like MNIST, or, you know, ImageNet, or whatever it is. And so, you know, I mean, neuroscientists, we can package data sets as benchmark challenges, as, you know, include baselines, and, you know, having packages of those things, like here's the challenge with this data set. I think that would, you know, unleash like so many people who are working in data science and machine learning. And but you have to bring them the question, because here they are, they're not neuroscientists. They don't know what the question is. We should make it so digestible. Like, this is the data set, this is the question, here are the inputs, this is the output, right? Like, that's all you get, like, in supervised learning problems. It's like, here's the X, here's the labels, do it, right? So, yeah.
Okay, so maybe to enforce the, so I'm going to turn over the microphone so I can't talk.
This is good.
Oh, yeah. No. I was just going to make a very quick comment that a lot of what you just said, Ila, really resonated with me. And the only thing that I would add to it additionally is I think we need educational and like pedagogical resources that are kind of embedded in the documentation for these tools and methods and models that we apply to the data. Obviously, the data sets need to be very documented and annotated as well. But I think, yeah, I mean, and I'm sure that you sympathize with this as a fellow theorist, that we need to build within the community like a common language and understanding, and we can't just be throwing methods at something and visualizing things and you know, just kind of going by
piecemeal, right?
Yeah, piecemeal.
That's
And
to mind. Like, our methods are piecemeal.
yeah.
Who does what on which data, which methods we apply to which data sets, all very piecemeal.
We need to understand, yeah, the assumptions that each method and model is making, and not just run them blindly. So, so yeah, that's just to say, when we do build this thing, we should include educational kind of component to it.
Here's the mic.
Oh,
You have the mic.
tiny comment. I think we might need incentive structures in the community to actually build resources like BrainScore and other or matching resources, as Ela was talking about. You have a lot of data sets, a lot of models. What is incentivizing this matching process, or what is incentivizing the model builders to really to be able to do this very quickly in a resource-based fashion? And I think we should, maybe learn from the computer science community as to how they did this. But benchmarking challenges and other kinds of these kinds of papers are actually really well cited. So that could be one way to have this, have more challenges, have more, and have sort of promotion committees look at these as valid contributions.
Is that what you see as like the 10-year, there was a sort of 10-year extrapolation, right? Where are things going to be in 10 years? Is it just going to be more benchmarking, or is there something, again, just sort of thinking about what do we need, what's the, what infrastructure is there? It's going to be a change in some fundamental paradigm that requires a different kind of sharing model.
Yeah, no, great points. And just to follow up, I totally agree with Ela and Alex as well. And basically to the education point, I think it also comes down to documentation, which sounds, maybe we haven't talked so much about the docs, but it's not all about the code, right? It's about how people can actually access it. So I think coming back to the computer science component of this, like people envision, and especially the large language model field, has done a really actually good job of making model cards and data set cards. And so this is one thing, like, as someone who's also ingested some of the data from these sources like neural pixels, and someone did ask this on the panel, like, what made it easy or hard? Or Tim and I, he was like, how do I make people use this? What was useful? And there is quite a bit of I don't know, activation energy, if you will, to like onboard to a new data set, right? And so then the question is can we make that more unified with some community standards? And maybe the community standards in computer science aren't exactly what we need, right? Like maybe we don't need every animal's, like, why was this taken? What was the consent? What was the, like maybe there's some degrees of this that is not perfect for the model cards that are out there. But maybe something like that is something we could get around the table and come up with. It would be very useful to have in these archives like Dandy. Because I'm thinking about the future, I think we have a lot of data, but we definitely need more. We need more good data. So I think what's going to happen in the future is large language models are going to flood the internet with shit data, right? And so this is a huge problem. It might not be fake neuroscience data, but in general, it's going to be bad data, right? And so how do we actually do quality control metrics on these types of things? Like what are the metrics, coming back to Alex's point on even just methods? Like methods and metrics for data, I think, is also another really important component that we should think deeply about. Like, as Martin, I sort of probed him, like, how do you decide if the data set gets on your benchmark, right? Like, this is another component. So I'll yield the floor. Sorry.
Jerome, I think, has a point also because our institutes and openness code is.
Yeah. I might preach my repeated perspective, but I'm just bouncing on the Micron, which I think was a hugely successful effort, and I think it shows the power of if you put a lot more thoughts into designing the experiment and getting people together with a goal, which is to tackle cell types in a very deep way. I think our community can do it, and we need to generate a number of these data sets that are asking the right questions, and there might not be that many, but I think the community could get together and bring together the experimentalists with the modelers, put together thoughts into what kind of data set we need to tackle emotions, what kind of data set we need to tackle credit assignments, all of these questions that are shared, and then collected. And then, because you're concerted, you can put the thoughts into building the educational tools. Like you can explain the metadata, you can do all of the QC that you said. It's time. I'm saying it again, but it's time that neuroscience do this. We're just doing spotlight research that is going nowhere. That's my perspective.
Like, I resonate with that a lot, but I would say it's neuroscience, cognitive science, and computer science. So again, I think we need to get out of that trap too. So, and you said ask the right question. So immediately that comes like, well, what granted you the word right, and why were those the questions? And so how do we go out of that incentive? That's essentially an incentive problem. How do we align on problems? And as an engineer, I kind of say it almost doesn't matter. Pick any problems and get started on them. And I think what you're going to see in 10 years is people have nucleated around some problems. They may not be the right problems, but anybody who can do that gets integrated sets of benchmarks. That's the word you were not piecemeal, but integrated sets of benchmarks. And that will then show those might be the wrong questions, but at least that's going to be make forward looking relative to where we are right now. And sort of don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good in that kind of activity space, which I think is what the spirit of this conference is about. Let's move forward. But we seem to get trapped on things like agreeing on the right questions and the incentives, and so maybe that does deserve a little more discussion. And we've thought a lot about that on BrainScore, for example. But these social problems are hard. Sometimes I think it'd go better if we just didn't have all of us humans in the loop, but unfortunately.
It will complement the efforts of, in sort of in the machine learning world, where those problems, right, those problems will be perceived to have been solved. And so there are areas where they're not solved, and I think that sort of those are the areas that the questions as neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, and even those sort of aligned computer science will naturally gravitate to, the harder problems.
Sachin.
Yeah, I'm going to just quickly follow up on that a little bit. You asked where would we be in 10 years. I hope we're not talking about data standards or data sets in 10 years. And if we can be there, that would be a change, right? Because
It'll be different.
let's hope we don't talk about spikes on it.
Unless you solve it. 10 years.
But I think that is the challenge, because right now we are talking about many of those things. So I just heard from Eli and Mackenzie about quality of data, quality of metadata around the data sets to be able to find these things appropriately. And again, NIH has put something together about sharing data, but it's leaving to the community how that data is shared and how that data is organized. And ensuring good quality of data requires everybody's participation in doing the labels appropriately, in figuring out the provenance of those labels, in annotating these things. And that's where standards come in, but they raise resource constraints because most labs aren't used to doing it right this minute. So I think maybe there's both an institutional problem and a lab problem that could be solved about how do we make this easier for people so that the downstream use cases that the data provides, Martin talked about, if I could connect directly to the data sets on Dandy, that'll be fantastic, right? Eli talked about finding data that could be useful to grad students. And one question I brought up is, what about education of both undergrads and grad students? How do we incorporate some of these resources into the curriculum itself, as opposed to saying, here's yet another course? And that's also resource intensive in the sense of the effort that's required to change some of the dynamics of that process. So I'm going to toss it out there as I don't know the answer, but I hope that in 10 years, we're not talking about data and metadata the way we are right now.
So I have to say I can't imagine that world, and the reason is that the data that we're getting now, as innovative it is, and as much of a dream it is compared to where we were 10 years ago, that's not the end point, right? We're just starting to scratch the surface. We got maybe reconstructions of cells from 1 cubic millimeter of cortex. That's not, right? We can imagine a future where the types of data that we're getting and the data formats have to keep evolving. We're gonna have to keep talking about them, because we're gonna be getting very different data, I think, 10 years from now.
Well, I mean, shouldn't ChatGPT kind of have solved the problem of data types? Because presumably I just give a natural language description of a data set. I give a data set whatever is my native use case, and then I press a button which is upload, and I don't do any formatting, and then something just vacuums that up, hoovers it up, and then ChatGPT can convert it using any translation from one to one, the different format. Maybe we should not even care, that shouldn't even be a problem anymore.
But we can try it now.
We should try it now.
We can try
I
it.
don't see why we should even ever have a data format debate anymore. In today's world, I think it's more about make it easy to upload, just to some central repo, and then make it easy to translate. And I mean, right? I'd love to hear if that's possible, but I will.
So I can take my answer to that. I think it's going to be within 1 to 2 years that should be possible. The challenge, though, is the extrapolation that's necessary to deal with. So right now, one of the things that we deal with in terms of data formats is scales of data. So every data set. Microns was 1 millimeter cube. They're going to do the whole
Two petabytes.
that's 2 petabytes of data. We don't have infrastructure directly in place to interact with that right now. And that seems like an engineering problem that ChatGPT won't be able to solve. But for many data sets, I think there will be a route that allows for that kind of thing in the scale and scope. I think these tools also, when was ChatGPT released? November of last year, right? That was version 1. That's going to evolve. We're already seeing impact of it in all kinds of ways. So I see that happening. I just don't see it covering the space of neuroscience, given the complexity of projects that are coming online. We know that the whole mouse brain is going to be EM'd in the next 5 years.
Like what, 10 millimeter cube?
No, I think it's a whole mouse brain.
No, that would not be EM.
It's the
That's
one,
a
the 1
projectile.
centimeter cube.
That's an axonal
That's
map,
like
but the EM is going to be 10 millimeter cube.
Yeah, 1 centimeter, sorry.
Yeah.
Yes.
10, no,
No,
10
10 millimeter
millimeter, not 10 by 10 by 10, but
Yeah, 10
10
millimeter cube.
millimeter.
10 times the volume of micron.
Yeah, 10 times the 1 micron, the 1 cubic millimeter.
I want to talk about something that's much more mundane, at least to me, but I think really critical, and that is the sustainability and continued usability of some subset of really useful tools. So if you think about DNA sequencing, NIH has paid to support BLAST since I've known about BLAST, and I'm really old. And so what tools are we going to put on such a stable platform that the NIH, I mean, PubMed is just, Google now will find things as quickly, but they always send me to PubMed. I think this community and its larger antecedents need to start deciding which of these things do we really have to put on a firm platform. And people have started to ask me, sort of, what's the succession plan for NeuroPixels? I must be looking old these days. But it's a legitimate question because they've become really essential tools. And if somehow interrupted availability, it would really screw up a lot of theses. So I think that we need to start focusing on at least some specific functions. They can evolve over time, but somebody's got to ante up and say, we're going to keep this live and current and available for the long term. And BLAST is my example of it's been there for 25 years or something, maybe longer.
Just a +1 on the need for standardized metrics for evaluating quality. And I think places like Dandy are a perfect place to have those conversations as a community, right? So if anytime I updated primary ephys or ophys data or uploaded spike sorted units, Alessio can tell this story better than I can, but like we just went through this process of staring at IBL code, staring at kilosort code, and staring at our code for computing what we putatively call the same thing in terms of unit metrics. Like that's kind of silly. But if there was one single transparent place where those numbers were computed on your behalf, that the submitter didn't have to do that themselves, then human error like that would fall out of the way. And then people like McKinsey and others who are looking for data and need to know like what's good and bad for my particular situation would have a really transparent way to do so. So +1 on that idea that I heard.
All right, any further comments on this topic? All right, so I'm going to ask a question myself. So, Ila, you mentioned, for example, that we have a set of data sets, set of tools, and the ideal would be, okay, let's connect these things together. And that would mean that, in advance, we knew what would be the right and ideal set of parameters to record, what would be the ideal metadata to include, and so on and so forth. A priori, we don't have that knowledge yet, right? That's it's very hard to connect a lot of different experiments with each other because each of them is designed with a very specific purpose in mind. And I think that's one of the challenges that we're facing now. Like, how do we bring these together? How do we connect these dots? Because, a person builds a model, finds something very interesting about a little circuit, but then it remains isolated. I think that's the bottom line of in physics, they have CERN. But there's a theory that says, all right, let's look for this thing. So as you record the data, you even know what not to include, what to discard, and what to stream and what to store. We don't have that vision in neuroscience yet. And from any of you or any of the audience, any suggestions about how do we approach this issue, and how are we going to solve this problem?
Well, just to a small piece of the problem that you mentioned, we don't know what is the right metadata for a data set. I think that, authors would include whatever metadata, springs to mind for them, whatever purposes they collected the data for, what the properties of the data are, and then you could imagine allowing users with some, maybe institutional, credentials, something like that, to add to the metadata, right? So any user who is then published on the data, or even just an institutionally credentialed user could just add metadata to the data, right? They could say, right, by the way, this is useful for unsupervised decoding, type of analyses, right? And they just add that in, even though that was a data set that was posted for, I don't know, hippocampal navigation, right? So I think that's a way you allow users to add tags and metadata, right? That's kind of the, pictures on the web get annotated that way. I think that's useful. Didn't have the verification, the image thing, how many traffic lights are there.
So if we're thinking about what data and metadata needs to be captured, the question, as we've kind of talked about many times, to me seems to be along the lines of what's the goal of the data set, right? And so there were two comments made yesterday, one by Matteo and one I think by Ali Pasha, where Ali Pasha suggested throwing out all of the data after you gather it and just recording the sufficient information required to regather it. That to me strikes me as an incredibly high bar. But Matteo mentioned that in IBL they had this problem repeating data sets. There were all these things they weren't aware needed to be controlled, and they didn't realize this until they tried to gather the exact same data set in 22 labs or in 11 labs. And so both of those there are bringing back the idea that of experimental replicability into the data pipeline, essentially. Those are both incredibly labor intensive, but that's kind of the where the rubber meets the road is my analysis and my conclusion should be able to survive any differences that I don't think are important. And that's one way of trying to guarantee that. That was more of a comment, not a question.
I'm just wondering whether you can think of, say you have a paper that you write and you publish the data set. Isn't the paper kind of the metadata for that data set, because you're describing the methods, right? And then if you have the code uses the data, right? And so then theoretically, yes, if there are some guidelines, you should be able to tell ChatGPT, just go ahead, use the information that's in my paper, and use the code that I used to create the figures based on the data. Go ahead and write the metadata. Or maybe that's even a redundant step. Maybe if you just have a data set and you have your paper and you have the code, then that's all the information that you can provide there.
I think there's one of the things that's interesting about the neuroscience community compared, say, to the way physics works, which my impression as an outsider is that as a community, in physics, the community will say, we're going to set up a 10-year goal. And there's a lot of buy-in. Experiments that go on in searching for a Higgs involves 20,000 people. We don't do anything like that. And nor necessarily should we. Our field is not like that. But I think one distinction is that the questions that we pose are not so focused. And in contrast to the way I think astronomy does it, or physics. I very much liked the way Andrea posed this question about the dimensionality problem we have with so many cells in the nervous system that we don't know what they do, and at a very highly refined level. I think that's a really important question. So I think putting questions out there like that was very valuable. I would put one more on the list. Why do we need 5,000 synapses on a dendrite? I don't think we have a good answer for that kind of input to get a yes/no output from a neuron.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on what Maria was just saying. And I mean, do we think that the traditional paper is still the best way to communicate what we're doing and to move science forward? I mean, arguably, you could provide a suitable data set, code, good metadata, and then ChatGPT can write the paper for you.
I mean, in a sense, that's kind of what you're saying, right? You're saying instead of treating the paper as primary and the data set as the thing that dangles off the paper, it's like the data set is primary, and then the paper is just the metadata for the data set. Right?
Or the papers.
It's just one piece of metadata, right? And then a second person comes and writes a paper on that data set, and that becomes a second piece of metadata for that data set. So it's like the data set is the thing, and everything else is metadata.
Well, I mean, the paper's narrative. I mean, the data set is the metadata plus the data, and then the paper is narrative.
That will require a sea change in how scientists get hired and promoted.
Yeah.
And good luck with that.
Yeah.
It's a good one.
Well, we're the ones who make those decisions.
I don't know why I'm wading into this conversation. It seems like a little bit of a landmine, but I guess I'd say that I sympathize with a lot of the things that are saying. I would take maybe ChatGPT out of the root. I think we should be, reading our papers and writing our papers for each other. But I guess I do sympathize with the basic idea that I don't think we need a perfect data standard or metadata standard to shoehorn every single data set in. I want to hear the narrative behind why you collected this data, what was the motivation, and what was the scientific hypothesis. And natural language, I think, is the right kind of medium for us to communicate those ideas. So I guess I would very much put myself behind what Ela is saying, in that maybe we don't need to think about, we should have some minimal data standard, but it should be flexible and it should be easy to use, and that's the most important thing. And if people put out data sets that aren't well documented, they're going to get ignored. If you put out a data set that's well described, it has a good motivation behind it, and all these other things, then it'll get used and it'll get cited and you'll be rewarded by that. So I don't think we need to overthink things on some level.
So Mackenzie, and then would you mind passing back to Jared?
Yeah, actually, Alex, I think you just touched on several things I think is important, and also Tim about incentives. So it struck me when Martin, in your talk, you said 1 model a day submitted to the benchmark. And shouldn't that be 1 citation to the paper as well? We're not being rewarded for the things about reuse of these things, right? Or a new version comes out, or I don't know. We need different incentive structures to reward people for actually sharing good data, to Alex's point. There doesn't have to be one standard, but it should be done. I mean, and maybe to Maria's point, I am really hard pressed to find a paper where I could do what you said. I don't, at one point, our community manager went through all the citing papers that cite Deep Lab Cut, 3,000 papers, went through and read the methods section, and there was 2 that I could maybe actually reconstruct what they actually use Deep Lab Cut, what Git hashtag, what Python version, what environment, what model even. They don't even, there's 15 different backbones. They don't even say that. What the training set was, what the evaluation metrics were, it's not in there at all. It's not in our methods sections. It's not even in the GitHub repo for these papers. So I would love an example where someone has been able to do this, because I actually don't know a single paper that I could reproduce in this way, fully computationally at this point.
Yeah, I was just going to push back a little bit on the idea of being sloppy or not conforming to strict standards with respect to publishing data, with the hopes that ChatGPT or AI could patch it all up, because there's a lot of power in, if you do conform to very strict standards like NWB, then it enables a lot of analyses in the short term. And even if you could have AI or ChatGPT go in and clean things up, how do you trust that it's doing the right thing? Because we want to be rigorous in our scientific questions. So maybe it could do a good job, but how would we know that it's not making a mistake? Whereas if I think that it is a valuable effort to try to make things as standard as possible so that they're interoperable.
Yeah, so I'd like to address 2 points. First of all, I'd like to speak loudly in defense of the paper, and the argument that natural language is the thing which gives you the highest flexibility, I think, is a very good one. Now, of course, there are things wrong with the paper, in particular that people have transformed it into an artwork of, obtuseness. How complex can I be? How much can I show off? But that's not necessarily a weakness of the format in and of itself. You can look at computer science, for instance. In their case, a lot of papers have been replaced by conference presentations. But it's still natural language. It's just that some people have realized that audio can be a lot more convincing than reading. Another huge advantage of papers, I think, is the restriction in dimensionality. Like, a lot of people have very fancy 3D figures, and they look really cool, especially if you do them with Blender. But the problem is, when they're 3D, it is much more difficult to focus people's attention on a specific detail. The data is way too rich. Everybody looks at it, and it's very difficult to make sure that everybody's referring to the same thing. In addition, in papers, you have like inline statistics. So you make a statement, and then you say, this is the value for the hypothesis test, or this is the F value, and you put it right next to the statement. So you substantiate what you claim with the best you can come up with in terms of empirical evidence. So I think the paper is really excellent, and we shouldn't throw it away. And the other point was regarding reproducing a paper, even if it's using your own toolkit, right? In a sense, if papers were contextualized, like the output document is still a PDF, it's still a paper, people can read it. But if the production of that were contextualized as a piece of software, directly from the raw data, with absolutely all code, including Python, blah, 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 LaTeX included, then basically the paper repository is the full documentation. It works automatically, operatorless. There's an upcoming article by Halchenko and McDonald and Janusz which deals with that. But I think the notion of free executable papers is very difficult, I fully agree, but I think it's something that can be explored and also doesn't really compromise the paper. It's still a paper in the end.
Just want to extend a little bit. So it seems to be, it doesn't have to be either or, right? So let's say, could we provide just verbal description of the paper? It will be insufficient because you don't know what metadata is needed. But this could guide that TurboTax-like software which you saw yesterday for data conversion, which already knows which metadata is necessary, and from your description, it could gather, you've forgotten to describe also these additional aspects, and then maybe populate more metadata in a structured form from your input. So it could be like more of interrogation technique using AI. And that would generate then nicely described, I think, data set with human kind of interaction or human input, but also really nicely prescribed metadata. That's what I think could be one of the directions.
Just a small point to connect a couple of things that were said. Many of you will know of eLife making a reproducible document stack like 4 years ago or something. This idea, you click on the paper, you click on a figure, you see the code, you can redo the analysis right there in the paper, the executable paper. And I haven't checked it in the last few months, but as of about 6 months ago, if you click on that paper, it doesn't run anymore. It was built on Stencila, something went wrong. And even if they've fixed it now, the point is, papers, if they're done in non-archival formats, whatever, actually on paper, they last, much longer than our lifetimes, much longer than our civilization, most likely. Tim was talking about stuff that is, 25-year-old algorithms. So I'm not meaning to comment just on the paper notion, but executable papers bring in the same fragility that our entire software system has. Dependencies build points of failure. So that applies to papers or like communicating in ways other than the traditional paper as far as Dandy or whatever. How long is this stuff going to last? But it's also, I guess I'll raise the more general question for any of these toolkits, a lot like what Tim was saying. What model are we talking about for the length of time we want this reanalysis to occur, for these tools to exist? What time scale are we planning for here?
Yeah, sorry. That's a really good question, but I'm going to follow up on an earlier point. I wish I had an answer. But I was thinking just of the question, I'm worried a bit about how top-down the approach we have in this conference seems to be, because I think in the end, it's going to be really hard to anticipate everything we need. So in terms of durability, also in terms of metadata. And something that occurred to me, I'm not the first to have thought of this, I'm sure, but one of the big strong points we see in computer science is the issues tab on GitHub. And I'm wondering what the version of that we can have for data sets, for our papers, to help the community give feedback directly, help the really important points rise to the top. You work with a data set, you say, I would have really needed to have X metadata to use this data. 5 other people thumbs up that. Next time they run a similar experiment, they think, okay, we're going to include this. I'm wondering if we might have to be a little patient and just give more opportunities for feedback from the community instead of guessing what we need just from our big brains.
Coming today.
So I'm not an archivist, and I think the term archive for any of the brain data archives is a really bad term to use. They're just data repositories. I think we should use that. I listened to a talk given by an archivist, and he was talking about how they preserve all kinds of things to read all the material over the last 80 years. And there's a whole room of equipment to read the kinds of things that are stored. Now, we think that it's easier in the digital space because we have bits and bytes and we have formats. Every project that we have done where we think we have Dockerized things, containerized things for reproducibility has broken down within about 3 years. CERN does a lot of this in their space. They house the data. They also store virtual machines that ran back in the 90s as digital bytes and code. So they could run software that was built in the 90s that doesn't run now on those machines on a simulated platform. If we are going to be serious about archiving, I think we have to have a whole different conversation around this. But I don't think archiving is the goal right now. Right now, we're producing data that will be superseded by data in the next 5 years. And we should really think about what the short-term goals of the data are and where large-scale data are produced, what the horizon is for which we keep them. So I think one of the questions that we have, with Dandy being a hat I wear, is what is the sustainability model? Not just in terms of dollars, but around what data should be kept around. And I think we need to, as a community, have a conversation around that, and that'll help people in thinking about what data should get sent to the repository. No, I thought there was a hand up there.
Yeah, two quick things. One, I think what should go away should be a data-driven decision. Like, nobody's using a thing for some period of time, it can go away. The other is a very tactical question. Why did your Docker projects fail?
Yeah. Now they're asking me a very technical detail, and I'll give the answer to that. So we had something that read from a network service inside the container. 2 things happened. The data was actually there in the network service. The SSL certificate expired. Now, that's why I say it's a very technical thing, but technically that's no longer reproducible in the same way as I had done. And these are, I mean, there are many details of construction of Docker or containers that anybody in this room would probably have challenges with to create a perfectly reproducible thing. And that's another area of education. Again, should every scientist have to learn that? And what does reproducibility mean? Again, I think these are broad questions. We're coming up on time today.
Yeah, so I think if there's one more question, we can address it. Otherwise, we move to the closing remarks by Sacha.
I guess I just wanted to raise a question that's not about the technical aspects of storing data, models, testing, blah, blah. It's actually the more conceptual question of once data sets become extremely widely usable, then we have to confront the problem of multi-hypothesis testing. It's a real statistical quandary. You know, you're going to take one data set and fit a bajillion models, and I mean, I feel like we're probably already overusing our data sets. There's a lot of leakage from training to test to validation. And once these data sets are like around and widely used, the leakage is going to be crazy. So we have to be very aware, right, of what we're doing when we're using these data sets.
Let's thank the, Jim has one more point. All right.
I'm just picking up on this. I have just a different perspective on. I think we're going to move to a world that we're basically building digital twins of what we're trying to do, and that's my view. Martin used that term in his thing too, and of course the theorists want something on top of that. But the next phase is to build digital twins, and whatever digital twins are capturing the most data are going to be the digital twins that are passed around and are portable in some way. Those are going to be our leading models of domains, and the things we need to keep around are going to be essentially unit test. Papers are going to be like whatever that was sort of a unit test that the digital twin is predicting something that will need to be stored, and everything else will kind of fall away because it won't be used. But that's just my prediction of how the next 10 years is going to start to look. And papers are now unit tests. They're not like understanding. There's no claims aren't there. They're just unit tests on does this model line up with the world in this respect or not? Because at the end of the day, they boil down to just a little bit of a claim on this particular aspect of something. And we're going to have integrated sets of somethings being explained by digital twins. And that's a very benchmarky perspective. And I think I'm channeling Martin as well, but that's just our guess, at least how vision will end up looking. Now, how all neuroscience will do, I don't know. And that has no theory, and I admit all that, but it's sort of, I also like to remind people that Kepler was 80 years before Newton, right? And so we're in Tycho Brahe Kepler phase. And we're not like physics in that we're trying to have grand questions. We're more like climate science of what's our best weather model going to be. And so we need to sort of blend the best of both of those somehow. Because this is complex systems emergent over many scales. We're not like fundamental questions of some grand theory of like, this is the Maxwell's equations. It's not like that. I'm sorry, but it's not. Yeah. Anyway, that's an engineer's perspective, and I'll stop.
All right. So I love that the last comment was actually very good in terms of being both provocative and also maybe a little bit pessimistic for the future.
No, it's optimistic.
Hopefully we can challenge that.
We're going to have models that predict stuff. We already do. That's optimistic. And then theory will follow, but that will be 100, that will be a long time.
All right. Matt, do you have something to add? No? Okay. All right, so let's thank all yourself, basically, and the great panelists that we have. Round of applause. Okay. So we're going to conclude this session today with remarks from Satra, who is the brain behind the idea of putting Dandy together, and has been instrumental with Yarek and Ben and Oliver in bringing Dandy and NWV together and creating a very cool platform that now is used by Allen Institute and folks from Flatiron are being involved. So that's really fantastic. And so without further ado, I give the platform to Satra to conclude the session. But 2 remarks. Tomorrow morning, we're going to meet in that room, for those of you who are here. We're going to meet in the room across the yellow wall, basically. That's for the morning session. And then from there, we scatter to different panel sessions. And for tomorrow evening, we're going to be in the other room, which is on that side. You look up the numbers, you will find it very easily. So.
All right. Well, before I wrap things up, I just want to kind of give a shout out to Nima, who did a lot of behind-the-scenes work to get this started. Thank you. And many of you know it just from the emails you've received. But there were perhaps 10 times the number of emails that he had to contend with for getting this event together. Overall, this has been fantastic to get all of you together. It seemed like this panel discussion would be an entire other event just by itself that we should consider putting together, maybe thematically in some ways, for the future. So as part of ODIN, which is the Open Data and Neuroscience Initiative here at the McGovern Institute, we're planning to hold 1 or 2 of these events every year. And we would like it to be kind of community-driven in terms of thinking about how some of these elements can come together to change that future that Jim and Ela and Matt talked about over the next 10 years. We are seeing a cultural shift in many of the ways we do neuroscience today relative to 10 years back. We're seeing scales of data. We heard about new instruments being created, and we heard about a fantastic set of tools that work with those data and a set of platforms that work together on it. And then we kind of ended today with a set of models. It brings together everything from design, data generation, all the way down to modeling and thinking about digital twins. As a slight anecdote, I think Austria and maybe one can find this out, has a digital twin repository for their public epidemiological data, so that people can do all kinds of analysis on it without violating privacy rights of individuals. But this idea of digital twins, and there's a National Academies panel and working group kind of working on defining some of the elements across the space of science and technology of how it would be useful. And it's really, I think, a nice model for us to maybe think about the next symposium around, in thinking about how these pieces fit together in the context of serving digital twins. We already had talks today, that at least two, which talked about digital twins and how we think about them as models of the brain. But we also have to think about the real model of the brain itself. I mean, are these abstractions on the brain? Are these actual models of the brain? Because there's a lot of biophysical work that people have done as models of the brain. So we also have a spectrum of models on the brain that people have been looking at and targeting across the space of neuroscience. So I'll end with asking this, and you don't have to answer this right now, but think about who are we missing in this conversation, and who should we be bringing in as part of future symposia? I feel like certain mathematicians would be great for some of the things we are discussing. Certain computer scientists would be great. So it's not just neuroscientists doing computational neuroscience. It's not just neuroscientists generating data or neuroinformaticians creating platforms. We see this as a broader effort across disciplines, as I think Jim said earlier, neuroscience, cognitive science, computer science has to come together. So I would like you to send us your feedback, how you thought about the symposium. Tell us what we should do next. And I hope to see many of you at a future Odin event. Thank you for staying for 2 days, and see some of you tomorrow.